So let's pick up on your team personality profile. Maybe go to the discussion forum and share with your classmates what you learned about your team as you diagnosed and analyzed your different individual team members and their personalities. How much diversity and personality do you have? What's the average when you look across the team? And then importantly, what are your intuitions about what the impact of that personality team profile would be on your team's performance or key processes like creativity, conflict, communication, those sorts of things. Now that you've had a chance to assess and analyze your own team, I want to share with you some of the insights we've learned from our work and our research across different organizations. So here's one. We often talk about conflict, and when Maxim talks with you about team processes, conflict will be one of those really important processes that you want to dive deep into. But generally, we understand what conflict is, and task conflict is when we're really focused on the task itself, and we disagree on how best to accomplish that task. So whether we have low task conflict or high task conflict, and ultimately how that conflict impacts team performance, what we find in our research is it actually depends on the personality of the team. When the team is really not open to new experiences or different ways of thinking, not open to new ways of doing things, what we find is that task conflict has a pretty strong negative effect on team performance, as you can see here with the blue line in the graph. But look at the other line, that gold, or as we at University of Michigan like to call maize line. When your team is really open to new experiences, new ways of thinking, new ways of being and acting, really high openness, task conflict can actually help the team perform better, has a positive effect relative to less task conflict. And so ultimately, the impact of conflict really depends on the team's personality, in this case, openness. Now, interestingly, what we find is we find a very similar pattern for emotional stability. When there's a lot of conflict, you want people who are emotionally stable, who don't get too positive or too negative, don't overreact to that conflict. And that's exactly what we find here. When we have high levels of conflict and the team is really low in emotional stability, or in this case, the opposite would be highly neurotic, what we find is that conflict, that high task conflict, can have a severe negative effect on team performance. But in contrast, what we find is the opposite effect for task conflict when our team is really emotionally stable. When we're able to stay calm, we can handle that conflict more effectively and turn that conflict into a positive for our team and ultimately perform better. Really important insights for how personality interacts with team processes that, again, you will dive much deeper into with Maxim in a couple of sessions to try and understand how do we effectively manage these conflicts. But when you think about composing and designing your team, there are things you can do now that will help you when this conflict comes. Importantly, in this case, according to these data, really focus on building an openness to experience or selecting people for your team who are open to new experiences, new ways of thinking, new ideas. Selecting and composing your team of people who are really emotionally stable will help you use the conflict for good as opposed to allowing that conflict to detract from your team's performance. Now, in a different study, we've also found that team personality has an impact not only on conflict, but creativity as well. So what you see here on the x-axis is the number of people in the team that are high on extroversion. So just to reiterate or reinforce what extroversion is, extroverted team members are those that are really social, really outgoing, really get their energy from stimulating social environments. People who are low on extroversion, or what we call introverts, are people who really get their energy from less stimulating, less social environments. And so what we're seeing here is that the impact of extroversion on team creativity is actually conditional on how much confidence there is in the team on their ability to perform the task. In this case, the creative task. It's a new product development task that they're working on. And so what we find is that the more extroverts in the team, when they're less confident, actually hurts the team's creativity. But The more extroverts in the team, when that team is confident in their ability to perform this creative task, that extroversion, which generates more communication, more ideas, more sharing of information, actually helps drive that creativity in the team. Very important insight. Now, interestingly, we find a very similar effect for openness. Openness, the more open people you have on your team can really help drive creativity, but only really when that team is also confident in its ability to deliver on that creative, in this case, new product development task. So there's this interaction between personality and confidence that's important to understand. So what's the implication for you? If creativity is the goal, you want people who are extroverted, you want people who are open, but you're going to have to build that confidence within the team that they can perform and deliver on this creative task. Because if they're not confident, that extroversion, that openness can actually undermine your creativity. So select people who are extroverted, select people into your team who are open, and then work as the team leader to build that team's confidence in their ability to perform this creative task. So what happens when we look across teams? What I'm sharing with you here is the latest meta-analysis on personality, again, the big five, and its impact on team performance. Because thus far, I've been looking at just the average level of personality within the team. But teams are composed of individuals, and individuals have different personalities. And so what's the average level of personality on each dimension? How heterogeneous is the team? So how much variability or variance is there? Diversity in personalities. But then we also get interested a lot of times in what's the max or the min. So if we look at our 4 or 5 team members, who has the highest level of conscientiousness? And does his or her level of conscientiousness predict team performance? What about the minimum level? Interestingly, what we find is that the average level of personality has a much greater effect than the maximum, the minimum, or in this case, the diversity or heterogeneity of personality. What you're looking at here are called meta-analytic correlations. The positive correlations mean that as conscientiousness increases, so does team performance. The negative correlations, for example, with conscientiousness and heterogeneity. In this case, the more heterogeneous my team is in terms of conscientiousness, the more diversity, the worse my team performs. And then the minimum that you see here is that minimum level of conscientiousness, predicting team performance, or agreeableness in this case. When you diagnose or analyze your team, you not only want to pay attention to the average, but you want to pay attention to the max, the min, and the variability as well, because each of these can impact the team's performance. Now, what we find when we look across all of the studies in history published on personality and team performance, the average has the strongest effect. But the minimum, when we're talking about conscientiousness and agreeableness, for example, is equally important, if not more. And for heterogeneity, if we're going to look at diversity, it's really about conscientiousness. Anything about above 0.15, 0.2 is a pretty significant correlation in this case. Anything above 0.3, bordering on 0.4, is quite strong, to put that into context. So again, what's the implication for you when I look at these data? When you're selecting team members into your team, you want to think very carefully about conscientiousness, and you want to think very carefully about agreeableness. You want to make sure the average is as high as possible, and that the minimum in your team is as high as possible. You do not want a really low person on conscientiousness and agreeableness if you can help it. That would be, if I had to point to one implication of these data for how you compose and build your team, conscientiousness and agreeable, we want as high of an average as possible and a low minimum. Emotional stability, openness, we want the average for those dimensions to be high as well. Things like extroversion, it's going to be conditional on our ability to build things like the confidence in the team and those sorts of other dimensions to really drive team performance. So hopefully that helps give you some data and some insights on how you would think about personality and using personality to compose your team, and if you have the opportunity to select new team members into your team, how's that new personality going to fit best with the personalities that you currently have on your team, which would help you think about the average, the heterogeneity, that max and that min as well. So hopefully you can use those insights, map out your team's personality profile, see where the gaps are, and ultimately begin to compose your team by selecting people who provide you the best mix of personalities for the task and the goal that you have in your team.